The rope snapped halfway down the well, a dry crack that echoed once, and then died in the dark. The bucket never came back up. It hit something far below with a hollow sound that told her everything she already knew. There was no water left to lose. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood there with her hands braced on the stone ring, breath fogging the air, and listened to the wind scrape across the valley. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open and shut as one of the children moved inside. They were used to silence like this. Silence was safer than asking questions. The well had been the last thing her husband touched before the fever took him. He'd sworn it would hold another winter. He'd sworn the rock beneath the yard was good stone, old stone, the kind that kept water even when creeks ran dry. He'd been wrong. Or maybe the valley had changed. Either way, the debt collectors didn't care what kind of stone lay beneath her feet. By morning, 3 men would ride up from town. They would measure, they would write, they would talk about arrears and notes, and the land reverting back to men who could make use of it. They would look at her children and speak softly, like people do when they've already decided something ugly. So she lowered herself onto the cold ground beside the well and did something that surprised even her. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was that, or break. The laugh stopped when she noticed the stone. It wasn't the rough field stone the rest of the well was lined with. This was smoother, darker, almost polished by time. Her fingers traced a shallow groove where the bucket rope had worn a channel over years, and the stone felt cool, but not dead. It held a faint dampness that the rest of the well no longer had. She leaned farther in, careful now, peering down into the black. There was space beneath the collapsed section, not water, space. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin had settled into its familiar groans, she lit a lantern and went back out. The flame trembled as she lowered herself into the well's mouth, boots finding purchase where her husband had once cut small footholds. She moved slowly, listening to the scrape of stone, the hiss of her own breath. The collapse wasn't total. A shelf of rock had fallen inward years ago, probably when the valley froze hard enough to split trees. It blocked the old water channel, but beyond it, beyond that, there was a hollow. She squeezed past the fallen stone and dropped the last 2 feet into a chamber no wider than a root cellar. The lantern light caught on walls that weren't natural. They were stacked, shaped, fitted with a care that didn't belong to luck. Someone had been here before her. She knelt and pressed her palm to the floor. It was dry, too dry for a place this deep. The air smelled of old earth and something else. Charcoal, maybe, long cold. She lifted the lantern higher and saw a narrow cut in the far wall, a seam where stone met stone but didn't quite match. Her heart started to beat faster then, not with hope exactly, but with possibility. Possibility was dangerous. Possibility got people killed. But she'd already lost everything safer than this. She worked in silence for 3 nights. During the day, she played the part they expected, a widow stretching water rations, boiling roots, pretending not to notice how close the children stayed to her. At night, she went down into the well with a borrowed pick and a shovel handle she'd cut short to fit the space. She didn't tell the children. She didn't tell anyone. Valleys like this survived on rumor, and rumor would kill what she was trying to build before it ever had a chance. The stone came away easier than it should have. Not soft, but cooperative, as if it had already decided where it wanted to break. Behind the seam was a narrow passage sloping downward, no more than shoulder width, packed with dry soil and old debris. The walls bore marks, tool scars that didn't match her husband's hand. These were older, cruder, patient. She widened the passage inch by inch, she hauling dirt up the well in sacks she stitched from feed cloth. She spread the soil behind the barn, under cover of darkness, tamping it flat with her boots. Anyone watching would have thought she was trying to level the yard. No one watched. Widows disappeared early in the eyes of a valley. On the 4th night, the air changed. It wasn't dramatic, no rush, no sudden warmth, just a subtle difference, like stepping into a cellar on a hot day. The lantern flame steadied. Her breath didn't fog as thickly. She sat back on her heels and listened. Somewhere beyond the stone, water moved, not a stream, a slow, patient seep, the sound of something that had all the time in the world. She followed it. The passage opened into a low chamber, wider than the first, with a ceiling she could almost stand under. The floor dipped gently toward a shallow basin carved directly into the rock. At its center, dark water pooled, not deep, not flowing fast, but alive. She dipped 2 fingers in and tasted it. Cold, clean, not the sharp bite of surface runoff, but the flat, mineral calm of groundwater that had never seen the sun. She sat there for a long time after that, lantern burning low, thinking not about tomorrow or the men riding up from town, but about winter, about how water froze, about how earth didn't. She didn't just clear the chamber, she shaped it. Over the next weeks, she carved channels so seepage fed the basin without flooding it. She built a stone lip to keep silt out. She lined the passage with scrap wood where she could, not for beauty, but to keep the walls from sloughing in. She learned the rhythm of the place, how long it took the basin to refill, how the air moved when the temperature dropped outside. The children noticed the difference before anyone else did. They stopped coughing at night. The skin on their hands stopped cracking. When she sent them to fetch water, they came back with buckets that didn't frost over in the cold. They didn't ask where it came from. Children raised on the edge of losing everything learned when not to ask. The men from town came, just like she'd known they would. They stood by the broken well and shook their heads. They talked about liabilities and improvements and how unfortunate it all was. One of them bent and peered down into the darkness, wrinkling his nose at the smell of damp stone. "There's nothing here," he said, straightening. "No water worth speaking of." She nodded and kept her hands folded in front of her apron. Let them think it was over. Let them write their notes and mount their horses and ride away with the comfort of certainty. They didn't see the trapdoor she'd fitted inside the well ring, flush with the stone. They didn't feel the warmth rising faintly from beneath their boots, slow and steady, borrowed from the earth itself. By the time the first real freeze hit the valley, her cabin floor was warmer than it had ever been, not from fire alone, but from something deeper, something older. She'd cut vents beneath the stove, angled the stone so heat sank down instead of bleeding away. The chamber beneath the well became more than water. It became a lung, a reservoir, a quiet engine that worked while she slept. Neighbors noticed when their pipes burst and hers didn't, when their barrels froze solid and hers stayed liquid, when their children came over and lingered too long near her hearth, cheeks pink not from fire but from warmth that didn't fade when the flames died down. They asked questions then. She answered carefully. She spoke of repairs, of small improvements, of making do. She didn't speak of what lay beneath the well, shaped by hands that understood the valley better than the men who claimed to own it. She didn't speak of the way the ground itself could be convinced to help you if you listened long enough. By midwinter, word had spread anyway. People stood at the edge of her yard and stared at the well like it might open and swallow them. They whispered about tunnels and hidden rooms and debts paid in stone instead of coin. Some were afraid, some were angry, most were simply curious. She kept working, because she knew something they didn't yet understand. The valley wasn't shocked by what she'd built. It was unsettled by what it revealed, that everything they thought was gone had been there all along, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig. The first man to ask outright was the blacksmith. He didn't come riding with papers or measuring tools. He came on foot, boots crusted with frozen mud, breath coming hard in the cold. He stood at the edge of her yard longer than most, eyes fixed on the well, not the cabin. People who worked metal learned early where heat liked to hide. "You got water," he said finally, not accusing, not friendly, just stating a fact. She didn't answer right away. She was splitting kindling. The small dry pieces she saved for mornings when the fire had to be coaxed back to life. The axe came down, steady, measured, like everything she did now. When she looked up, she didn't smile. "I manage," she said. That should have been the end of it. In the valley, that was usually enough. But the blacksmith nodded slowly, like a man turning something over in his head. "My trough froze solid last night," he said. "First time in 10 years. She stacked the kindling, wiped her hands on her apron. "Winter's been hard on everyone." He watched her for another long moment, then left without another word. By the next week, it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was need. The creek that ran through the center of the valley disappeared under ice thick enough to hold a wagon. Wells that had always been reliable went silent. Their buckets coming back up rhymed with frost and nothing else. Families burned more wood trying to keep pipes from freezing than they could afford. Tempers shortened. Voices rose. Her place stayed quiet. The warmth beneath the cabin didn't announce itself. It didn't roar or crackle. It worked slowly, the way old things did. Heat bled down through the stone around the stove, collected in the chamber beneath the well, and came back up through vents she'd cut under the floorboards. Even when the fire went out at night, the cabin never dropped to the sharp, brittle cold that made joints ache and breath hurt. She noticed changes in herself before anyone else noticed them in her. She slept deeper. Her hands stopped shaking in the mornings. The constant tightness in her chest, the one she'd blamed on grief, eased just enough that she could breathe without thinking about it. She still missed her husband. That didn't change. But survival stopped feeling like a punishment. The children grew bolder. They spread their blankets farther from the hearth. They laughed louder, the sound sharp and startling in a valley that had grown used to quiet endurance. When neighbors' children came over, they lingered until dusk, reluctant to step back out into the cold. That was when the questions started to sharpen. People didn't ask how she was doing anymore. They asked what she'd done. She answered the same way every time. "I fixed what was broken." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The second freeze came harder than the first. a cold so deep it made trees split open with sounds like gunshots. Chickens died on their roosts. One family lost a cow overnight when the water in its trough turned to solid ice before dawn. That night, someone knocked on her door. Not a polite knock, not a neighborly one. It was urgent, almost panicked. She opened it to find the blacksmith again, this time with his coat thrown over his shoulders and his hat forgotten entirely. "My boy," he said, voice rough. "He's burning up. We can't get water warm enough to keep him from shaking." She didn't hesitate. She wrapped herself in her coat, told the older children to watch the youngest, and followed him out into the dark. She brought 2 buckets with her, lids tied down tight with rope. When they dipped into the well, steam rose faintly in the cold air. The blacksmith noticed. He didn't comment. At his house, she didn't explain what she was doing. She set the buckets near the hearth, showed them how to mix the water with snow to bring it to the right warmth without shocking the boy's skin. She showed them how to keep the heat steady, not chasing it with fire but letting it hold. The boy lived. Word spread faster after that. People stopped pretending they were just curious. They started asking for help. She set rules without ever saying they were rules. No crowds, no shouting, no digging near the well. Anyone who came for water came quietly and took only what they needed. Anyone who broke that understanding didn't come back. Most people understood. A few didn't. They learned quickly. The men who'd come from town returned in midwinter, drawn back by rumor they couldn't ignore. They brought another man with them this time, someone with cleaner boots and a sharper pencil. They walked the yard again, their eyes more alert now. "You've made improvements," one of them said, glancing at the cabin. "That usually requires notice." She stood in the doorway, the warmth from inside spilling out behind her. "I fixed a well," she said. "That's all." They looked down into the dark mouth of it, the same way they had before. This time, one of them dropped a stone instead of a bucket. It fell, struck something solid and stopped. No splash, no echo of depth. "Dry," he said. She didn't correct him. They left again, unsettled but empty-handed. There was nothing they could seize without proof, and proof required digging. Digging required effort, tools, and time. Winter discouraged all 3. She expanded the chamber beneath the well carefully, not outward but downward, following the slope of the rock. She didn't chase the water source itself. That was a mistake only desperate men made. She shaped around it instead, letting the seepage feed the basin at its own pace. She learned how the air moved, how warm currents rose and cold ones sank, and she adjusted vents no wider than her hand to guide them. It wasn't invention, it was observation. One night, as she worked by lantern light, she found something lodged in a crevice near the far wall. At first she thought it was a tool head. When she freed it, she realized it was a child's shoe, leather, cracked with age, the stitching done in a style she didn't recognize. Someone else had lived down here once, not recently, long enough ago that the valley had forgotten them. She didn't tell anyone about the shoe. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into a corner of the chamber, a quiet acknowledgement of the hands that had started this long before hers. Whoever they were, they'd understood the same thing she was learning now. The earth remembered. By late winter, her place had become a quiet center of gravity. People didn't gather there openly. They passed through 1 or 2 at a time. They took water. They warmed their hands. They left food sometimes, or firewood stacked neatly against the shed without a word. She accepted what was offered and refused nothing outright. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, and besides, the valley was investing in her now. She felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders, heavier than debt but steadier. The children began to help. The oldest learned how to check the vents, how to listen for changes in the way air moved under the floor. The middle child kept track of how fast the basin refilled, scratching marks on a scrap of wood. The youngest carried messages, quiet ones, between families who didn't want to be seen asking for help. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if unsure it was welcome. When the thaw finally started, it came all at once. Snowmelt poured down from the hills, flooding low ground, turning paths into rivers. Wells that had frozen now filled too fast, water turning muddy and unsafe. Cellars flooded, foundations shifted. Her place held. The chamber beneath the well took the excess water and gave it back slowly, the way it had been shaped to do. The vents that carried warmth in winter now carried damp air out, keeping the cabin dry when others smelled of rot and mold. That was when the valley stopped whispering. They started talking openly about what she'd done. Some called it clever, some called it unnatural, a few called it dangerous. One man said it was unfair, like survival was a resource that ought to be rationed. She listened and said nothing, because she knew something they still hadn't faced. What she'd built wasn't finished. It was only the first layer of something deeper, something that would matter more when the next crisis came. And it would come. The valley always made sure of that. The first real test of what she had built didn't come from winter. It came from rain. Spring in the valley had always meant mud, but this year the storms stacked on top of each other like debts. Clouds rolled in heavy and low, pressed against the hills until the air felt thick enough to chew. When the rain started, it didn't fall, it settled. Day after day, night after night, a steady drumming that soaked through roofs and patients alike. The creek burst its banks before anyone thought to worry. Water spread across the low fields, swallowing fences, turning paths into brown currents that tugged at boots. People stayed inside at first, waiting it out the way they always had. Then the wells began to fail again. Not dry this time. Worse. Water turned cloudy, then sour. The shallow shafts filled too fast, pulling runoff down with them. Animal waste, rot, whatever the meltwater carried from uphill. Families who had survived the winter suddenly had nothing safe to drink. Boiling helped some, but fuel was scarce after the long cold. Children started getting sick. Not dangerously yet, just enough to frighten people who'd already had their share of fear. She felt the change beneath her feet before anyone came knocking. The chamber under the well grew louder, not rushing but insistent. The basin filled faster than it ever had, water darkening at the edges as silt tried to creep in. She adjusted the channels she'd cut, narrowing one, widening another, guiding flow the way she'd learned to guide heat. The stone responded, shedding what it didn't want, holding what it did. She was working down there when she heard voices above her. Not one or two, a group. She froze, lantern held high, listening. They weren't angry voices, not yet. They were uncertain, overlapping, the sound people made when they didn't know who should speak first. She climbed back up slowly, wiped her hands, and opened the trapdoor before anyone could decide to force it. They stood in a loose half-circle around the well. The blacksmith, two farmers from the lower fields, a woman whose husband had died the same winter hers had. No tools, no papers, just tired faces and wet boots. "Our water's gone bad," one of the farmers said. "We heard yours hasn't." She nodded. "It hasn't." The woman stepped forward. "We're not asking to take it all." That was important. She heard it, the way people heard the creak of ice before it broke. "Come one at a time," she said. "Buckets only, covered, and you tell no one who doesn't already know." No one argued. The valley learned something in those weeks. Not about wells or stone, but about restraint. People queued quietly, even in the rain. They kept their voices low. They didn't linger. They didn't pry. Most of them. One man didn't listen. He came at night, alone, thinking darkness gave him cover. He pried at the stone ring with a crowbar, chipping away at the edge where she'd carefully sealed the trapdoor. The sound carried through the ground like a shout. She confronted him before he could do real damage. He didn't threaten her. He didn't need to. His desperation did it for him. "You don't get to decide," he said, rain slicking his hair to his face. "This is land. Water. It belongs to everyone." She stood between him and the well, lantern light steady in her hand. "Then everyone needs to treat it like it belongs to them," she said. "Not like something to steal." He looked at the well again, at the stone, at the quiet strength of it. Whatever he saw there made him lower the crowbar. He didn't come back. But the incident changed something. She realized that as long as what she'd built was only hers, it would always be under threat, from fear, from greed, from misunderstanding. The valley didn't need a secret. It needed something sturdier than rumor. She didn't announce what she was doing. She simply started building again. She expanded laterally this time, carefully, following the natural seams in the rock. She didn't open new water sources. She created holding spaces, small chambers that could be isolated with stone plugs she shaped by hand. When runoff surged, she could divert it. When water cleared, she could release it back into the main basin. She added a second vent system, this one dedicated not to heat but to air exchange. Dampness that would have rotted beams elsewhere moved out slowly here, drawn by temperature differences she'd learned to predict. The chamber stayed cool, dry, stable. It became something more than a well. It became infrastructure. The blacksmith noticed first. He always did. "You're thinking like a town," he said one evening, standing near the well while she replaced a stone. "Not like a household." She didn't deny it. The valley resisted the idea at first. People were used to patching, not planning, but the rain kept coming, and the old ways kept failing. Slowly, almost without realizing it, they started to rely on her system instead of fighting it. They brought stone, they brought timber, they brought labor, quiet and uncelebrated. No one asked for ownership, no one asked for credit. They just worked. The men from town came again when the roads dried enough to pass. This time they didn't pretend it was about paperwork. They stood at the edge of the yard and watched the steady flow of people, single file, respectful, organized. They saw the stonework, the vents, the careful order of it all. "This isn't just a well," the man with the pencil said. "No," she agreed. He hesitated. "It changes the value of the land." She met his gaze. "Then you should be careful what you do with it." They left, without measuring anything. Summer came hard and hot after the rain finally broke. The ground cracked. The creek shrank back into itself, thinner than before. Wells that had been fouled never quite recovered. Some families talked about leaving. Her place didn't dry out. The water beneath the well cooled the air drawn up through the vents. The cabin stayed bearable, even on the worst days. She rigged simple stone shelves in the chamber to store food, learning how the temperature held steady even when the sun baked the valley above. People noticed. Again, she didn't hide it this time. She showed them the entrance, not all of it, just enough. She explained how the stone worked, how the ground held memory of heat and cold if you let it. She didn't dress it up. She didn't claim invention. She spoke plainly, the way she'd learned to speak since everything else had been stripped away. Some listened, some didn't. Enough did. By the end of summer, 2 other families had begun digging, not copying her exactly, but adapting the idea to their own land. One failed and collapsed a wall. No one mocked him. They helped him shore it up and start again. The valley changed quietly after that. It didn't become rich. It didn't become safe. But it became less fragile. She still carried debt. That didn't vanish, but it stopped growing. People paid her in small ways, repairs she didn't have to do herself, food set aside for her children, labor that saved her time. The balance shifted, slow but real. One evening, as the heat finally broke and the air cooled enough to breathe, she went down into the chamber alone. She sat by the basin and listened to the water move. She thought of the shoe she'd found, wrapped and hidden, of the child who'd worn it, of the hands that had shaped this place long before she'd been forced to see it. What she'd built hadn't shocked the valley because it was clever. It shocked them because it exposed how much they'd been ignoring. And because once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The valley didn't collapse the way people always imagined disasters would. There was no single night where everything broke at once, no storm people would name years later. What came instead was quieter and harder to fight, a season where nothing fully failed, but nothing truly worked either. Autumn arrived thin and dry. The rains didn't return the way they usually did, and the ground that had been soaked in spring now cracked open again, splitting along old fault lines. Crops came in light, wells held water but barely. Families counted jars and sacks more carefully than they counted days. The valley existed in a narrow balance, one mistake away from tipping. That was when the men from town came back for the last time. They arrived together, not scattered like before. 3 horses, clean tack, coats brushed. They didn't go straight to her yard. They stopped first at the blacksmith's place, then the mill, and then the lower fields. They talked, they listened. By the time they reached her cabin, they already knew what they were going to say. "This arrangement," the man with the pencil began, "can't continue like this." She didn't invite them inside. She stood on the threshold, the children behind her, silent and watchful. They'd grown used to these moments. They could feel when things mattered. "It's not an arrangement," she said. "It's work. It's control," another man replied. "Whether you mean it to be or not." She didn't raise her voice. "You're welcome to dig your own." The man's mouth tightened. "That's not the point." They spoke of safety, of oversight, of liability if someone got hurt underground. They spoke of bringing in engineers from the city, men who would know how to do it properly. They spoke of permits and shared ownership and the need for things to be formalized. She listened until they ran out of rehearsed words. Then she asked a single question. "Who keeps it working when they leave?" None of them answered right away. She stepped aside then, not to invite them in, but to let them see. She lifted the trapdoor and let the warm, steady breath of the earth rise up into the cool autumn air. She didn't guide them down. She didn't explain. She simply let the work speak for itself. They peered in. They saw the stonework, patched, shaped, scarred by hand. They saw the channels, the vents, the careful order that had grown not from plans on paper, but from necessity. They saw that it wasn't finished, but it was alive in the only way infrastructure ever was, responsive, forgiving, "He's stubborn. This wasn't built all at once," the man with the pencil said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It was built every day." They left without taking anything, without signing anything, without promising they wouldn't be back. She knew better than to call it a victory. What settled the matter wasn't law or ownership. It was winter, returning earlier than expected, sharp and impatient. The first hard freeze hit before the last of the crops were in. People lost what they couldn't harvest in time. Animals died where they stood, caught between shelter and pasture. The creek skimmed over with ice again, thin but deceptive. The valley turned inward. Families who had dug their own chambers found out who had rushed and who had listened. Some collapsed, some held. Those who failed came quietly, not to beg, but to learn. She helped where she could, sent others to neighbors who had figured things out for themselves. The system beneath her well became the backbone of the valley, not because it was centralized, but because it had taught people how not to be, not careless, not wasteful, not alone. The debt collectors never returned, not because the debt vanished, but because it stopped being leverage. Land that could keep people alive year after year wasn't easy to take without consequence, not when the valley understood its value better than the men who'd once dismissed it. One night, deep into winter, she went down into the chamber with her oldest child. She showed them the shoe. The child didn't ask whose it was. They didn't need to. "They started it," the child said softly. "Yes," she replied, "but they didn't finish it." The child ran their hand along the stone wall. feeling the warmth held there long after the fire above had gone out. Will someone finish what we start? She thought about the valley, about the people who now listened to the ground instead of cursing it, about the quiet way knowledge had spread, not through force but through survival. Yes, she said, if they need to. Spring came gentler this time. Snow melted slowly. Water ran clear. The chambers beneath the wells breathed, taking in excess, giving back what was needed. The valley didn't thrive, but it endured without panic, without collapse. That was enough. On the anniversary of the day, the rope snapped, and the bucket vanished into darkness. She stood by the well again. She leaned on the stone ring and listened, not for water but for the deep, steady sound beneath it. The sound of something built to last because it had to. What she built beneath the broken well didn't shock the valley because it was hidden. It shocked them because it worked, and because once they understood it, they could never go back to pretending the ground had nothing left to give.